Digital 410 proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II-based podcast. And we are back for another Monday night. Joining us, as always, well, for the most part, Jeff Copsetta and Henry Sledge. Gentlemen, how you all doing tonight?
Doing good. How's everybody?
Doing good, doing good. How are you, Jeff? Well, you know, we're always about sticking the jabs here and there. What do you guys think of the new theme song? You like that?
Nope.
Perfect.
I miss the old one.
Yeah, me too. But, you know, just ain't worth it.
I miss the old one too, man. Since you got dinged on the copyright, let's I don't know, get some social distortion or something on that.
Oh, yeah, because there's no copyright on the CD that came out in 1994.
Yeah.
And the song is probably older than our guest. But speaking of our guest, Henry, why don't you introduce our guest for tonight, sir?
Yeah, so tonight we're really happy to have someone that I'm proud to say I've become friends with last year, Mr. Garrett Shetrawski. Garrett is a United States Marine Corps Reserve officer. He, for the last 5 years, has been researching and working on a biography of someone that's near and dear to my heart, that is Captain Andrew Haldane. So, Garrett, welcome to What's a Scuttlebutt, man.
Thank you, Henry. Appreciate it. Really appreciate you guys having me on tonight. Excited to talk to you all. A big fan of the podcast. So, again, thank you and looking forward to it.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you on.
Absolutely.
So, Garrett, did you say that your specialty in the Marine Corps is logistics? Did I hear that right Saturday?
Yeah, I'm part of a logistics battalion,
Okay.
actually a regiment.
Okay. And how long you been in the Corps?
Coming up on 3 years now. So I commissioned in November of 2020. Direct path. The son of a Marine, and kind of wanted to go in college, and that was kind of during the sequester cuts of 2013. As Don had laid out, I was actually born in 1994, so I am just as old enough for the copyright. So I decided to go into business and did that, but it was an itch I couldn't scratch, and came back through the OCC program in the fall of 2020, earned my commission, went to the basic school, went to MLS school, and then transitioned into the reserves.
Well, it's since we focus on the World War II stuff, let's just jump right in, man. Tell me, and I know because you and I have gotten to know each other, but tell our listeners what led you to become interested in ACAC.
No, absolutely. I'm from Massachusetts, born and raised here. I was a 3-sport varsity captain in high school, and had taken some military history classes, and With the Old Breed was recommended to me by a teacher. And while reading that, obviously such a fantastic book for anybody, regardless of your in-depth knowledge of World War II, as I think we all know. But your father had so eloquently talked about Captain Haldane, and in the basis of that book, there's a footnote that had highlighted how Andy was known for a cup that was given at Bowdoin every single year. And I just remember being like a senior in high school and applying to colleges and being like, wow, Bowdoin College is a really, elite institution. And the fact that he's still honored up there, 70 years later was kind of stuck out to me. Fast forward about 7 years later, I had rewatched The Pacific, and whenever I get interested in something, I want to go pull a book about it. And I spent about an hour and a half trying to find something on Andrew Haldane, and I kept on, referred back to With the Old Breed or Islands of the Damned, periodicals that are in the Marine Corps Gazette, and I was just like very surprised that there hadn't been something that was comprehensive of his life. And that's where I was sort of like, I think that needs to be fixed. I don't know why I thought I could be the one to do it, but I had found an article from Stephen Moore, Andy's nephew, right. And I out to him, and thankfully I always joke, I swear Andy's mother knew someone was going to write something, because that lady had kept everything of Andrew's, his childhood scrapbooks, high school and college scrapbooks, every letter, medals, notes that he had written home while at college, and they were very well preserved, and no one had seen them until Stephen had given them to me. So that's where we got started at.
Leave it to a Marine in the logistics department who said, you know what, there's nothing here. I'll find it and put it together. I'll track it down, and we'll just get it done.
Beans, bullets, and Band-Aids, right?
Well, and that's a good start. Let's, before you get to the unreleased previously letters, Where did you, after you got this wild hair, this bug, this crazy idea, hey, and by the way, it's surprising, it's surprising, especially after the production of the Pacific, that somebody through that production didn't go out. And usually they'll bring in an author or two to kind of put out some coinciding books to raise some interest. So it's kind of even more peculiar that even after that production's been out for so long that even a guy like you who was looking for it couldn't find anything.
I 100% concur. Now, I think obviously Band of Brothers drove such interest into numerous individuals from that series who then went on to write their own books, and that's great. And I think the major difference is Andy died.
Yeah.
And none of those gentlemen did. And unfortunately, if it wasn't for the Pacific, which I think they did a really good job, and obviously, with the old breed, I think Andy would have been lost to history, and that would have been a serious shame.
Mm-hmm. So,
one of the things, I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Garrett, I think it was when we were on that Zoom show that really kind of, I don't know if you were on that or not, but Bruce McKenna was on there, Scott Gibson, of course, Leighton, everybody, like September a year ago. It was kind of when I first got back into the community. And Stephen Moore came on, and that was pretty cool, for me to meet Akak's nephew. But one of the cool thing about Captain Haldane, I remember from hearing from Stephen Moore, was that he really, and corroborate this or correct me, whichever, he really was not a fantastic student. He was a good student. He did okay, but he was not just like straight A's, enter baccalaureate. He was a good, solid student, but he had that charisma. He had that ability to make people feel special. People liked him. Obviously, he was a great athlete. What am I on the beam there by saying that he got it done as a student, but he was not fantastic?
I think that's honestly being a little bit nice. The captain might look down on me now, and you probably laugh. You'd probably say it to yourself. But yes, it was very much. And I think there's a unique part of my book that I want to showcase is that we learn about Andy Haldane, whether it's in Guadalcanal or on Waltz Ridge or in Durham Peleliu, but we really don't learn a lot about what made Andy Haldane into that great officer. And I think you have to look at Bowdoin. You have to look at that grit that took a first-generation American of immigrant parents who didn't make it past grade school and struggled academically, but went to 2 prep schools and took them 2.5 years to get accepted to Bowdoin, and then went there and did struggle there, but never gave up. He was a captain of the football and baseball team, and he worked in the kitchen. And you try to think about, man, like you are the star athlete, you're the stud of the school, and you're waiting tables after practice on your fellow peers, no less.
And furthermore, where do you get the time?
I have no idea. But he did struggle there, and he turned it around. I think a great example of that is his senior year. They had actually given him a $140 scholarship, which sounds like minuscule comparative today for college, but to forgive the loans that he had taken because he had improved his grades so much. Mm-hmm. So, he did struggle there, but I think that also what makes Andy such an easy guy to get along with, and why enlisted Marines who were 17 or 18 years old, who probably dropped out of high school themselves, didn't feel like he was this, overbearing figure and looking down upon him.
I know that if you go by what my dad wrote about him, and I love the scene of that, they're coming back from a training exercise on Pavuvu. It's late afternoon. It turns into a thunderstorm, and it's gloomy, twilight setting in, and they're just humping up the trail, trying to get back to camp on Pavuvu, and Akak's just walking along the line, talking to different people, and Sledge said, I felt this warm glow inside when he stopped and started talking to me, because he made me feel like something other than a caged animal being trained to fight, like I was a human being, and he actually gave a damn.
Empathy. And anybody who's been in the service, or you guys all very well versed in military leaders in the history of the military, even outside of the Second World War, I think that's a characteristic that anybody describes someone, even outside of the military, a CEO, a politician, someone that has empathy. And I think it was a great example when they're on Peleliu on D-Day, and he's having Jim Anderson as runner. And Jim Anderson writes, Andy asked me if I could go over and link up with the 7th Marines. Bullets flying. You're on the beach of Peleliu, and Andy's not ordering someone to do something. He just says, hey, can you go do that for me? that's the type of guy I think he is, calm, cool, and collected at all times, and treated people with respect. Which is kind of hard to find.
And sometimes in that situation, it may be easier for someone to do something if they feel like they're doing someone else a favor.
Yeah.
Or they have a choice, even though truthfully they didn't. But, sometimes it might put a little more motivation in their step.
For sure. But, to have the mental capacity and the bearing to do that in those situations is always easier in garrison. It's always easier when you're in a classroom.
Yeah.
But to do that when the bullets are actually flying, I think it's just remarkable, and it just shows who he was.
What year did he ship off to boot camp?
He left, so he graduated Bowdoin in the class of 41. That summer he had stayed up in the Bowdoin area, and he actually enlisted in the Marine Corps on May 6th. So back then, they enlisted before going to officer candidate school. You got a really cool photo with him and Sam Brown belt on with a PFC chevron, which I still have no idea how that worked, how they got uniforms or anything. But he was the assistant coach at Bowdoin for football that fall before being called in the end of October to go to officer candidate school. So he was at OCS when Pearl Harbor happened, and they were actually in the barracks playing poker on Sunday Liberty when it came over the radio of what had happened.
But their training got fast-tracked real quick.
Yeah, they went from I believe an early March graduation date to the January 31st graduation date, and then as all officers still today, checked out and went across the street and went to basic school.
Fast forward about 79 years, Jeff kind of experienced something in his boot camp, right, Jeff? A little bit?
Yeah, week 10 of my 16-week one-station unit training, September 11th, changed everything.
You can't get a more, I guess, probably a comparative example to America being attacked without having any sort of, probably had more of an inclination in Pearl Harbor than we did in 9/11.
Yeah.
So, that must have been quite the experience. What did the drill instructor say to you guys?
That we had already qualified with our rifles, and because we were Cav Scouts and a combat arms MOS, they could pull us at any time. So lace up your boots tight, gentlemen.
Get the blood flowing.
What's that?
I'll get the blood flowing.
Yeah, that was something. If you don't mind, I'd like to cut in here because I've got a thought that's just rolling around in my head here that Garrett, maybe you can help me out. So, I think we all agree here that how well a job Scott Gibson did. Whether we know a whole lot about ACAC or not, it was just such an incredible portrayal of one of those officers that doesn't need to wear rank immediately earns that respect from people. But my thought is, you were digging to learn about this guy, and which is what prompted you to do this project. There wasn't a whole lot out there. I'm curious now, what did Scott Gibson draw off of to put those pieces together? You can't just read 3 or 4 books about this guy and really become, I think about this recent biopic about Elvis, where, Austin Butler sits there and watches every Elvis movie and every, recorded interview, and he sits in Graceland for a while. He became him. And Scott Gibson is all he's really drawing off of is Henry's father's book and a little couple excerpts from the Marine Gazette. That's unbelievable to me.
I think there's 2 prongs to that. It's one, Scott did a fantastic job playing Andy Haldane, and I think him bringing him back to life just created so much more momentum of understanding ACAC was outside of the basic Marine Corps or World War II historians. And I even think before the Pacific, you had to be a pretty well-versed historian outside of reading the Old Breed to really understand Andy Haldane, because I believe Scott really brought him back to life. 2, they did have a lot of letters that Andy had written back and forth between the Dean of Students at Bowdoin and the President of Bowdoin that are in his file that HBO had used. Funny anecdote on that, the president of HBO now, but at that time he was a producer of the show, was Gary Anthalls. He was Bowdoin class of 84. So there was a connection to Bowdoin specifically from the production team. So they did have that information. Andy's file at Bowdoin is pretty comprehensive, and there was a lot of information in there that they pulled from. One of the mistakes they did talk about, and I think Steve has highlighted it, Henry, is when he sits next to Sledge and he said, our ancestors could have possibly fought against each other in the Civil War. Andy's parents didn't come here until 1913. So, that wouldn't have happened. But that was like a minor hiccup in the show of them taking maybe a little bit of a liberty without going through it all.
Well, Garrett, better to do something like that than take the liberty of like having Sledge carry a revolver when he was really carrying an automatic. I mean, thank God they didn't do that, I'm just kidding.
Well, as we've said before,
talk about a jab.
As we've said multiple times on the show when it comes to those
That's a joke.
series, sometimes it's more important to get the message across than it is the character and whose mouth you put it in. Perfect example, as we've said so many times, the whole story about the slit trench that they have Gibson telling in the P-41 ward when actually it happened to, Lecky. So sometimes it's just there's a thought, a consensus, something that happened a lot, i.e. guys who served in World War II whose grandparents could have very well fought each other during the Civil War. So once again, let's just get the message across, not so important whose mouth it came out of. I think a lot of time it comes down to.
Absolutely. Does the Pacific have gaps? For sure. Does the overall message of what it pushed of putting that part of the war back into the limelight and showing the stories of some individuals who matter? Yes. So again, we're always going to find fault at things, but I think overall more good than bad is the base layer for some of those things.
No, I'm saying that tongue in cheek now.
Yeah, no, we know.
Oh, for sure. No, I think it's hilarious though, because that you get to call it out. He's your father. And I think to an earlier point that Jeff and Don were talking about, no one really, and this kind of spurred my mind. I was speaking with Saul David yesterday. He's been helping me put this book proposal together. Using it as that academic resource for publications moving forward. Andy's story is so disparate between different books and publications. It's not all in one place, comprehensive start to finish. So, if Saul goes writing Devil Dogs, if that book was available, he would have a way more in-depth look at Andy Haldane and some of the leadership styles.
Oh, yeah.
Like that, rather than now where it's like you're pulling from so many different things and you don't really just want to re-say the same thing over and over again.
Right.
So that's my goal is to provide that. And, with those unseen letters that, the family had kept on for so long, you see a very different person than, the hard-charging Marine that I think we have in our mind.
I'm glad that it's a Marine doing the project.
Yeah.
Not that other people couldn't do a great job, but I like the fact that it's Marine in this day and age doing that project.
Well, they call it a baby devil dog comparative to him by, not even in the same universe. Happy to wear the same cloth, but, talk about shoes to fill for anybody. Any officer, and I've said this to you, Henry, second day of officer candidate school, going into the classroom, books flying, them kicking desks, people screaming, and I look up and there's a picture of Andy Haldane on the projector with a quote from your father of how he interacted with enlisted Marines. And this is the fall 2020. So he's still very relevant in today's Marine Corps. It's still very important, taught the junior officers how to interact with enlisted Marines and set the example.
And to Henry's point, I think it'll actually come in handy, depending on, obviously we don't know the direction and the depth of your book, where it starts, where it picks up, etc. But let's just say you're trying to fill in some of the gaps on his boot camp time or his early enlistment time. There may be some things that you're able to fill in that's not on the paper because you, even though it's a modern day equivalent, you at least went through the system and you know how to help project those feelings of maybe what he was going through at a certain phase of early enlistment, things like that. Whereas a civilian counterpart may not be able to do it in the exact same detail and glamour, not really glamour, but, shine a light on it appropriately.
For sure, some of the mannerisms, just Marine Corps-isms as we call them, just, especially Quantico, I think it's great that, unlike any other branch of service, every Marine officer goes through Quantico. Doesn't matter. You don't have to go to OCS. If you grab in the Naval Academy, you don't have to go to OCS, but you still have to go to the basic school in Quantico. So it's just like kind of this base layer common denominator that we all have that you can kind of pull from and say, hey, man, yeah, Quantico sucks at a very high level.
When you were looking down this material that was sent your way that probably very few eyes have been set on in the greater picture of things, did you have that aha moment or, come across that piece of letter or article or something that, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. This is a great idea, or something like, holy shit, I can't believe I'm reading this. Did you have that moment where just the light shined on you when you're starting this project?
Yeah, 2 times. And one of them wasn't what Andy had actually written. It was from the father of one of his enlisted Marines. And it was from Rockefeller Center in 1946, from a hotel. And he had, in December of 1945. And he had found out that Andy had died. And his son had been killed earlier on in the war. And he wrote to Andy's mother. And the letter is pretty moving, just about how much Andy meant to him, to his son, and how his son felt safe. And that made them feel good, knowing that even in the midst of this war, that their son felt safe. And unfortunately, he didn't come home, but Andy had written them a letter, and he just wanted to write to his parents and let him know that how much solace, knowing that he served them, that Andy brought to him. And then the last letter that Andy ever had written was about a week before he died, to a good friend. And that is a pretty intense look at his mental psyche at that standpoint and where he was at. And it's just rather unfortunate that, he passes away a week later.
Garrett, did you get a sense from that letter that you think maybe Andy was beginning to feel like his luck was going to run out? Because he had already been through Gloucester, and this was, you said, before Peleliu, or what was the timeline on that? When he wrote that letter you're talking about?
He wrote that on he wrote that on 7 October. He died 5 days later.
Yeah, okay. So all right.
He gets very spiritual. That's another thing. Andy stops drinking in Melbourne after Guadalcanal. He gives up drinking. He reverts back to the Christian Monitor Science textbook, the religion that he had practiced at that point. In his final letter, I'll read to you the last paragraph here. He says, "So it is out here, John, many of the situations that arise similar to Peter's experience, and we just know how to communicate with the Lord. His angels will bring us deliverance. I speak here of angels not as winged creatures, but as the thoughts of God's put in when he said, and when angels visit us, we do not hear the rustle of wings, none feel the feathery touch of the breast of a dove, but we know their presence by the love they create in our heart. Isn't that so? My next letter to you, John, will be after this blitz, so keep your thoughts uplifted for me, and we'll both get together around Xmas. I haven't reached that stage yet where material things have moved aside entirely for the spiritual, so I'm definitely looking forward to a cold beer and a chat around all that has happened in the past 2.5 years. Take care, John, and keep those fingers crossed."
That is very eloquent.
And that's when I read that, Don, to your question, when I was like, this stuff can't be sitting in a box, not seen by a wider audience. Not even, you don't have to be a Marine to appreciate that, I feel like.
It always amazes me. I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast feels the same way, because we all probably read subject matter, letters, old magazines, what have you. And obviously, letter writing was the primary form of communication at that time. But you can tell a distinct de-evolution in the communication between us nowadays, even with all the technology and the ways we have to communicate, versus that letter written in 1944.
Does that sound like a mediocre student to you? Because it doesn't to me.
No.
Oh, he would be a Rhodes Scholar by today's standards.
Seriously.
He would have every college fighting to get him in their English program to maybe turn him into a professor and put him out.
And he failed English twice at Bowdoin, which is so marvelous to me. Because he writes such beautiful letters from the Pacific. And he was a pretty prolific letter writer for what I believe as being an officer with not much time. But he did do a good job of communicating with a girl back at home. I'm not going to say girlfriend. I think he had feelings for her. They, definitely were close. They went to high school together. They communicated while he was at Bowdoin his entire time in the Pacific, and then to his sister and mother, and his brother was in the Coast Guard at the time, stationed stateside.
Now, I'm assuming you probably took these letters and tried to read them chronologically.
Yes, they were already in his mother had kept them in that.
As you read through them, through his, obviously I don't know where the letters start. I'm assuming he probably started college, boot camp, all the way through his time. As you're reading that timeline, can you tell how the war is affecting his, I don't want to say mental state, but his just overall well-being and how he communicates in his letters? Can you see like a obvious kind of timeline in his kind of telling, his, not really personality, but I guess his happiness or his, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but I'm sure you get the idea.
His mindset.
Yeah.
The evolution of his mindset, for sure. And I think Jeff can 100% relate to this. Anybody in the service, my limited time in the service, you have the ebb and flow. And I imagine him being downrange. You see this upward trend. I'm in a combat zone. I'm flying high on adrenaline. I'm riding limited. It goes kind of down when it's over, but then it spikes back up. Maybe I'm going to go home. And then every single time he finds out I'm not coming home. And I think it really dips down the most at Pavuvu before Peleliu. He was 2 islands in. He's sending Marines home. He's there, possibly could go home. And he writes home to Phyllis being like, it's not my time yet. The big guys think I enjoy this so much. But little do they know. But what do I have? I just carry on. And then you can tell the war's waning on him. He always jokes. He goes, now, since I got a company command, I'll be old and gray by no time. And it is and then right before the Pacific, right before Peleliu, you see him kind of dip back up again, that Marine mentality. Well, I got a job to do, so I'm going to do it really, really well. And I'm not going to complain.
It's kind of like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. He's a good leader. Everybody loves him. So now he's not going home. In the tale of Robert Leckie, if you're a brig rat, you went to the brig at least once or twice, you weren't eligible for the lottery. So it's like you had to, as an infantryman being there, it's like you had to ride ride the middle line if you wanted to, quote unquote, see any of the benefits, if there was any. But yeah, he was so good at his job, so beloved that shit, I ain't going anywhere.
I mean, officers are being lost at such a large clip, and take out a company commander with experience right before a campaign. Like I can see why the 04, 05 wars in charge is probably like, yeah, right. I mean, I'd like to have you go home, but it's not happening. You can't. But he left stateside in the middle of May 1942, passed away 12 October 44. So you think over 2 years straight of being out in the Pacific. There's gentlemen who have did the same thing, but a small minority to make it that far.
Yeah. And to have the added stress of being the guy who's sending guys out to possibly die.
For sure.
It really makes me think of how different my letters were to my mom as opposed to my dad. And I think, to draw from these letters to his mom, it seems to me that it would probably be a little difficult to actually get what was truly going on. And, I just think from my personal experience, my letters to my mom would be something like, hey, we just found out today Sergeant so-and-so is an arachnophobe, so we're all out trying to find as many camel spiders as possible to put in his sleeping bag. Or something along those lines. And then, hey, Dad, had another close call today. Now I kind of see what you mean by being a police officer when you don't know who the enemy is. Because I found very quickly in Baghdad that the bad guys didn't wear uniforms, were surrounded by the public, by children, by women. They were just mean mugging you on the street corner when you went by. You got an odd feeling about them. And so, two separate letters completely.
Sure.
Giving them both. But I wouldn't dare share the things I share with my dad. I wouldn't dare share with my mom to this day. So it would be interesting. And I don't know. So you say he's writing to his mom, his sister, and this girl. So I'm curious, where is his father? I don't know anything about his parents. So is he not in the picture? Is he deceased? What's the deal there?
No, Andy's father's there, and he's a very strong figure in Andy's life, from what I gather. He's a hard worker. He's a mill worker that actually rose to the ranks during the Great Depression and allowed Andy's family to move out of an apartment building and move into a house in 1933, which is so remarkable to even think about, that they leave Lawrence. They had been in the country for 20 years to the dot, 21 years, excuse me, and now they're in Methuen. They moved away. They have a car. And by no means was Andy wealthy, but the fact that his father was able to work hard enough to do that and get promoted to foreman inside the mills spoke to, his name was Cindy, to Cindy's grit also. Andy's letters are always addressed to mom and dad, nothing specific to his father that I have. Perhaps they've been lost the war, but I do have letters to Andy's father after he had died, to Bowden, and he writes about happy times. And my only regret is that I only had one son to send to your great college. And then he donated the Japanese flag that Andy had taken from the Pacific to the college as well, which still had Andy's blood on it, and is still in the archives of the college.
Oh, man.
Jeez.
Yeah, Dick Hansen, one of the enlisted Marines that Andy had trusted the flag with said, if I don't make it, bring this home. He was from Massachusetts, showed up in December of 1945 with the flag and followed Andy's wishes and gave it to his parents.
Garrett, did that flag come from Cape Gloucester?
That flag, I believe, was from Cape Gloucester, correct.
Okay.
And was carried with Captain Haldane. I do not have an exact location of where the flag was from. Maybe it was Peleliu. I'm not sure. I just know that he had instructed him to give that back to his family if he didn't come back.
Are there public images of that flag?
I have some. I've taken some in the archives. I believe the flag must have been flying on something because up in the top left-hand corner, it's got like almost like a rubber crowning on it that with a tie. So it must have been like they'll make that corner sturdy. So it had to have been tied to something. I'm not, maybe a pillbox or a command post. I'm not sure. To your point, Henry, that's what would lead me to think it would be Cape Gloucester. Probably that might have been retreated from or they had taken, because I can't imagine just a flag flying out in Peleliu in the open.
Yeah.
So
Now,
maybe.
when you're going through his timelines of letters, we've heard stories, whether they're true or not, that I would imagine so, that at a certain point, sometimes you just write on whatever you can get your hands on. Maybe paper's not always available. When you're looking through these letters, obviously they're the originals, not a PDF someone sent you. Did you come across some that were, hey, that's a K-ration box, or hey, that's a pretty interesting medium to write this letter on?
He did write mostly on lined paper. I think as an officer, he probably had access to,
That's true.
to more lined paper than an enlisted Marine probably did. He might have said, hey, I got to use it for plotting fields of fire or putting in grid coordinates. I don't know. But he did have lined paper or just standard paper. His letters in Cape Gloucester are interesting. You can see them. They have watermarks on them. You can definitely tell that it was wet while he was writing in the jungle, which I think is really, really cool. His writing while he's in Melbourne and Pavuvu was obviously longer and more eloquent because he's in R&R. He's in garrison, per se. But he did write right after the Ridge, Walt's Ridge, when he won the Silver Star. He wrote home to his football coach. And another great angle, his football coach at Bowdoin, Adam Walsh, was the center on the famous Notre Dame team with the Four Horsemen and Newt Rockne. And he's still in the Hall of Fame at Notre Dame as the all-time center for the all-time Notre Dame team. And, a very instrumental figure in Andy's leadership style was Adam Walsh. And he wrote home, he said, I want to tell you, Coach, that Ridge Fair really tests the mettle of men. And it reminds me a lot of athletics, but it definitely costs a lot more to lose in this game than it does in football. But, just a very in-depth look to Jeff's point earlier, like the different personalities you get in letters. I think you definitely get a more brave face. I'm out here doing what I need to do when you start seeing from the Dean of Students into the President, which are the letters that have been public for a while now and were used in the Pacific and some of the things that Scott had gone off of. Because, of course, he's speaking to an audience that he doesn't want to look weak in front of. But you get this much more human element to Phyllis, to his sister, Janet, who was his older sister, and to his family, of him saying, hey, I'm kind of getting tired of this. When I get home, we're going to paint the town red. All I would like to do is just see home one more time. If I can ever make it back to Bowdoin, it would really make me a happy man. If I could see Dad in his armchair one more time, I'd be really happy. Little things like that you're not going to say to the Dean of Students who's out there talking about you and how great of a war hero you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's great about this, and that's what I'm excited. People should see that and hopefully see the more well-rounded version of who he was and all the different things that he had to balance.
Hey, Don, can I lead to off the back of what Garrett just said, can I read just a really small paragraph from Devil Dogs?
Absolutely.
Because Garrett, I think this ties in pretty well with what you just said. Haldane also received a message from Paul Nixon, Bowdoin's Dean of Students. One of our undergraduates, wrote Nixon, has just brought me a picture of you and the account of Walt's Ridge in the Lawrence Daily Eagle. The picture makes you look as nice and friendly as a Baptist clergyman. In a response to a separate letter of congratulation from Andy Walsh, his former football coach, Haldane noted, quote, "I can sincerely say your instruction and guiding ways have helped me greatly in this task I have of leading men," end quote.
Spot on. I think he pulled from him very much so from a leadership style, in more ways than one. Adam Walsh wrote Andy's letter for his acceptance to OCS. One of them, he said, he ended it saying, all I could wish is that I had a son like Andy Haldane. And, talk about a guy who's coached football for 30 plus years, coast to coast, at some of the biggest colleges. He was at UCLA, Yale, played at Notre Dame, at Bowdoin. And then he said, pound for pound, he was the hardest running back that he ever coached coast to coast. Yeah. So high praise from an individual that's seen a lot of young men on and off the field.
And that, quoting that letter, what that reminds me of is in that scene in Band of Brothers when Buck Compton's lying there in the hospital and I think Malarkey's reading the letter to him. I know how much joy you bring the young men who are under your command or whatever. And, Buck just takes the letter and he puts it, he's done. I mean, he doesn't want to be bothered at that point. But that's just kind of what comes to my mind there.
I'd like to ask you guys, I mean, obviously you guys are all very well-versed historians, especially the Pacific War and the Second World War. What do you guys think of Andy Haldane? I know you get the pieces from the Pacific and with the old breed. Like, what is your high-level overview of him, or would a project about him interest you if you didn't know me and you were just walking by the bookstore and you saw something about Andrew Haldane?
Absolutely.
You can't ask me that question. I mean, you know it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I'll cede to Don and Jeff. I mean,
Henry, you don't count.
No, I definitely would love, I'm very, very interested because as we're saying before, there's very limited material on him, unless you try to find 4 or 5 books and pile that all together. And the information that the Pacific brought to us. I mean, as I said before, I'm surprised they didn't already have a book out after that production. So no, I'm jump through the hoops. I hope that your project goes forward and it turns out to be everything you want it to be for yourself and for us, because kind of like the Spears book that came out a while back. There's another character that we learned through a mass media production that had very little information, and that book came out. And so I think there's definitely a thirst for it, and I'm looking forward to it. Jeff?
Yeah, so I immediately, the first thing I thought of when you asked that question was, and I don't know how true it was, but the very first time I saw the Pacific, the scene where I guess they're back at Pavu. It's after they're at Peleliu. They're back in Garrison, and there's a Marine that just dumps a bunch of stuff in a trash can. And Sledge goes over to it, and he sees a book that belonged to Haldane.
Mm-hmm. And
it's a book that I own. It was a Hemingway book, yep. and I'm a huge Hemingway fan. So I immediately connected with whoever this Haldane guy is. I like him. But of course I'm like, well, this is Hollywood too. Like, who knows? But that mixed with now getting to, know Henry and, how he talks and how his father talked about this man. And then the combination of that and just guys that I've worked with, both in the military and the reenacting field, they said, oh, man, if you were anybody in that series, you'd have been him, which makes me feel pretty cool. Doesn't get any better than that. They're like, oh, man, you would have been Haldane or you would have been Spears if you were in those films. I'm like, yeah, that would have been cool. But no, I immediately connected with this guy, and I want to know more. And I can't wait. Hurry up. Because, yeah, I want to know more. Do it once, do it right. But I think your audience will be probably a smaller niche than most, and that's unfortunate. But I've said this on this show before, that thank goodness that people like Eugene Sledge had the forethought to write what they did, not only so we know what he did, but so people like Akak Haldane did not just get forgotten in that, just those stacks of names that never get a face and never get a second look and never get people like Garrett looking at their letters 80 years later to know about who they were.
No, I appreciate that, and I think it's 100% true. And to your point, like maybe probably in my opinion, the best and most famous book of World War II in the Pacific at a mass level is dedicated to him. So you're like with the Old Brain, you open it up and it's, dedicated to Andrew Akak Haldane. Who doesn't stop and immediately you're like, well, I might want to learn more about him. If this book is so great and Sledge is speaking so highly of him, that should probably follow on suit.
Speaking of names, when you're going through these letters that he wrote home, did any names come up that we would recognize?
Yeah, he was really close with Everett Pope. I don't know if you guys know that name. He won the Medal of Honor. He went to Bowdoin with Andy. He won a Medal of Honor at the beginning of Peleliu for his actions out by the point, but not on the point.
Was it Hill 120 or Hill 100?
Yeah, I think Hill 120. But don't quote me on that. I think it is Hill 120. I have it. It's in my outline. But he writes consistently of Everett Pope because they both went at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester together. When writing to the Dean of Students, he sees Evie. At one time, there were 7 Bowdoin alumni that were Marine Corps officers on Guadalcanal.
Wow.
Yeah, they called the Bowdoin Solomon Islands group. And they, had their own sort of underground mention of information, which was interesting. And he never wrote home specifically about COs or anything. Wow, it's escaping my name right now. Oh, when Colonel Schaffner had come on board at Peleliu, he did write home saying that they didn't really hit it off well. And that's kind of been a critique of Schaffner. Also, he was kind of dismissive of subordinates, great tactical leader. He had been captured at Bataan, escaped captivity, and went back to America and then went back to the Pacific. So, he was probably a pretty black and white, no bull crap individual, which I think we can all appreciate. But that was the only time he has sort of talked about anybody above him. He writes home about his animosity towards the Army, kind of. They're both in Australia together, and his Marines they're on a hike one night and they come across an Army company and they're like have a standoff of who's going to go over the bridge first. And he's like, I thought they were going to start shooting at each other. I was like, I could just so see him being like, oh my God, what am I going to do? It's pitch black in Australia. Every 19-year-old kid thinks he's going to win the fist fight. Yes, some of that he does write home to his sister Janet and all caps about how cool it was reading about the invasion of France while they were on Pavuvu. And that's another thing saying, I hope it's soon now, Janet.
Yeah.
I think it's coming. And I can imagine him being like, please just, I want to get home.
In the batch of letters and information that you acquired from the family, did you get a decent amount of maybe previously unseen photos, whether it's from his childhood, his time in college, and the service?
Yeah, there's a good amount. There's a couple of him. The one that's going to be on the cover of the book, his headshot is very widely known. But the one that's going to accompany that I want to, at least unless the publishing house says no, but I don't know why they would, is him playing football. And he's kind of like leaning down, taking a knee. And he looks like a movie star. His hair looks great, the sharp jawline. He looks like Ronald Reagan and playing the Gip.
Yeah.
And, seeing the two sides of him. There's a couple of him while at Bowdoin. There's some with his family. There's some original letters that he had taken on Guadalcanal and writes on the back of it, outlining what's going on and sent them home to his parents. So there's probably about 20 of those that are pretty interesting that you said that's never been seen. So there's some good ones, and there's one telling one that Saul had actually put in the book, I believe. It's a picture taken of him at Pavuvu, and the stark difference of what he looked like in May of 1942 to what he looked like in July of 1944, is pretty staggering.
Yeah.
Which, again, I don't think anybody can even imagine what that would do to them. So it's expected. But you can see the war is very, very much weighing on him in his eyes, his skin, his face, his hair, everything. He just looks a little bit haggard.
I think it was about 10 years ago, a photographer did a show, if you will, where he took...
That's a good one right there, too, Henry.
I think that's him right there.
I sent that to Saul.
Did you?
That's the officer of the Guadalcanal right there. The mustache growing contest that Andy had run point on.
And so, yeah, it was about 10 years ago. The photographer somehow got a series of soldiers fresh out of boot camp, took high definition, close up facial, portraits of them. And then after their tour in combat, took the same photo. And you can see, it's only been 2 years, year and a half, 3 years, depending on what happened to them in their time. And just the difference. You can see them fresh out of boot camp and then them fresh out of combat. You can definitely see the wear and tear on their face in that short amount of time. And so I can only imagine, seeing that of him.
For sure. And I'm sure Jeff probably, there's no way you didn't wear it, going on a deployment. Even if you aren't even in combat, you're just on a deployment, you're away from home, your sleep pattern's messed up, you're in the field a lot. Like, that's going to obviously wear on you physically and mentally. Never mind the fact you're getting shot at or not.
Nothing like the Pacific in World War II, though. No,
I would. And then Andy had a very, very bad case of malaria. There's a lot it did, but it did hit him pretty hard, and he fluctuated in weight 20 to 30 pounds in between campaigns. So I know that wore on him. He tried to break out of the hospital early in Melbourne and got in trouble for that, but he, went back. And one of the last, I think, is one of the biggest testaments to Andy Haldane, and another reason why I think this book needs to come out. And I had not known this until I had started doing research. I don't know why it's not in any books. It might be, I believe it maybe is in Devil Dogs, but after they had come home, the division had sailed from Peleliu back to Pavuvu. That spring, they had made a baseball field on Pavuvu, and they named it Haldane Field. And if you think about the 1,000 Marines that died on Peleliu, a little bit over it, you could have picked the Medal of Honor winners, PFCs, and sergeants that are backbone of the Marine Corps, gunnery sergeant. Like, officers always try to stay out of the limelight and don't really want that show. And we don't like to put that show in front of, especially the enlisted Marines. But the fact that they picked him and named the baseball field after him, I think it's just such an unbelievable testament to who he was and how well revered he was by his fellow Marines. It's a great photo of Haldane Field being dedicated. They played taps. They had a color guard, and the AP picked up the story, and it ended with the enlisted had beaten the officers, and they said Captain Haldane would have liked that too. And I think it's just a great, kind of touching point that a lot of men died out in the Pacific, a lot of great men, and the fact that he was kind of chosen out for that as an officer speaks volumes.
Henry or Jeff, either one of you have any follow-up questions?
I can, while Jeff's thinking of his next question, Garrett, so the mechanics of writing, do you find that you try to plug away on it a little bit every day? Or, like for me, I get 1 or 2 nights a week, with a 14-year-old playing 2 sports and God knows everything else going on. Sometimes I don't get to work on it as much as I would like. And although here lately I've had a pretty good groove, but do you find that, like, people like our buddy Jared Frederick, people like Richard Frank, people like Saul, James Holland, all these people have told me just keep plugging away at it. Do you find that you're able to do a little bit every day, or you're busy with life and then you get a break on a weekend and you just kind of dig in like Adam Makos goes into the proverbial cave? How is it for you, if you can share a little bit about that?
Yeah, the process is definitely obviously varies from the time constraints that you have, but yeah, I'd like to plug away on it. I started the outline on July 17th, 2017. I've kept that date there, remind myself of how far we've come. Now it's 89,000 words, 302 pages. And, I went through it with Saul over the weekend, and I was like, hey, there is so much here. Like, now it's starting time to condense that. So writing the book proposal now is the next step. And then getting this out to, hopefully some publishers to gain interest. There is interest from a few that we've already spoken with without even having to put this proposal together. So that is my goal of doing that. But yeah, to your point, I try to set off, KPIs or guidelines that I want to hit in order to do that. So I have a 12-month book plan. That was my 2023 New Year's resolution. I built a 12-month book plan with 3 to 4 steps for each month. And I just go through and check those out to try to stay on task, with my March being the start writing the manuscript, which should be, honestly, the outline is so detailed and there's so much information there. It's really kind of just taking those thoughts and just putting filler words kind of around it almost.
Right.
But the outline is reading the way the story is going to be read. It's starting from his childhood, high school, to the Depression, into Bowdoin, into the Pacific. And then the key piece of this that I really want to get across is the legacy that is still there 80 years later. You have a award that is given at Bowdoin every year, and Andy's name still since 1947, and is still the most coveted award to win. I've had a chance to interview over 30 of those recipients, and these guys are women are very successful business people, academics, politicians. You have a Rhodes Scholar and a congressman who had won it, and that they still say one of the greatest honors of their life is winning the Haldane Cup. You have an award at Methuen High School that's still given every single year, and the mayor and athletic director are very passionate about this project and seeing its success for the town that Andy had come from. So there's still so much there around him in today's Marine Corps, the Pacific. Scott Gibson's interview for this book was great, and what it meant to him for his career. So just compiling all that, I think the legacy piece is going to be important to make sure he just stays relevant.
Well, and you certainly already answered my question. So my final thought is just keep up the great work, and the legacy that Haldane left it'll be an interesting continuation of his legacy to see where you take it from here.
I appreciate it, guys, and I appreciate the audience, the help, the insight. Henry, you've been fantastic. Obviously, you have a personal connection to this, but Jeff and Don for having me on and listening to me blabber for the last hour. Anybody who's listening, feel free to reach out. I'm on Instagram if you have any questions or RFI standpoint. If there's anything that you think should be added that you may know or anything like that, always ears to listen and continue to make sure that this is the most well-rounded, complete assessment of a great man's life, start to finish.
And as always, if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, head over to WTSP World War II. That's WTSP WWII.com, and you can find the page for this episode, and we will have links to his Instagram page as well as some photos of Garrett. But before we wrap things up, we got a few more things to cover. Real quick, Henry, when you're asking Garrett about his writing styles,
Yeah.
I had a thought that I never thought of in the year or so you've been on here. Now that you've gone down this path of writing a book, as you were saying, you have a 14-year-old. Have you ever been sitting there looking at your dad's book and saying, how the hell did him and my mom get this done while raising me and my knucklehead brother?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Without a computer.
Yeah, without a computer.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean,
How did you
I
sleep?
could go on, and I won't. But yeah, no, yes, Don. To your point, I mean, because I remember what a pain in the ass I was. Always bitching about something, and he'd go lock himself in his study and write on those yellow legal pads, and yeah, I mean, it had to be. In a household with a family, you get
Yeah.
You just want to quiet.
Real quick.
When the book came out, Henry, was it like, what was it? Obviously, it was a great achievement for your father and for the family. But, was he very surprised by how much, acclaim it got out of the gate?
Well, the only thing that mattered to him was the Marine Corps, and they started, they had already had him. I think we touched on this Saturday. He wrote a 2-article piece for Marine Corps Gazette called Defense in Depth about Peleliu. So, yeah, I mean, the Marine Corps was the first to really start noticing it. And, but him being the kind of guy he was, yeah, I mean, he was always pretty self-deprecating and just kind of nonplussed, by the acclaim it got. I mean, I spoke on that a little bit at the World War II Museum. But he would get letters from veterans talking about, hey, I'm glad you told our story. I'm glad you did it, and he was just like, man, look, I just remembered what I saw and I reported that,
No, it's fantastic. I mean, again, that 18-year-old kid reading it and just going to put it down. Still can't. Still love it. Read it for the book and just pulling information from it. It's beautifully written. He does a great job encapsulating so many different things that I'm interested to see how he could have possibly cut out 500 pages. So
Yeah.
Well, you're probably going to be one of the ones when I get to that point that I send my manuscript to and go, okay, You've got some inner working knowledge of Haldane. Tell me what you think.
It'll be hopefully don't have any plans that weekend because they're getting canceled.
It's going to be a while away, Garrett, I promise.
Speaking of writing and putting words on paper, whether it's digital or analog, that's right. You can email us or snail mail us. People found ways to get letters to us. We want to hear from you. Email us at mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com. And that leads us over to Jeff. Jeff, do you have today's letter from the mail call?
I do, and this one is from Miss Rona Bushbaum again. Thanks for writing in again, Rona. She wrote us a real nice letter here just a few weeks ago, and she wrote us the other day that says, I was reviewing the digitized Auburn collection after this podcast and happened to notice a couple of photos of Eugene Sledge with a ring on his left hand, one of him in a kimono and one standing with Jay DeLow. Gosh. It looks even funnier when you see it in print, that guy's last name. Jeez. I'm not sure how Hollywood people make costume and prop decisions. Maybe they saw this and decided that that's what Joseph Mazzello's portrayal of Sledge should include in the Pacific. Wondering what Henry's thoughts are.
Yeah, Garrett, did we talk about this Saturday morning, or Don? Did we talk about the ring thing on early?
On last week's episode, we briefly spoke about the ring. Because our guest Jeff was talking about through that yearbook and the lady he knew how she brought her grandfather's ring home and it still had dirt and debris on it from combat. And so then I asked you about how in the miniseries they portrayed your father's always wearing his Marine Corps ring. And that's how we got on the ring conversation.
It looked like a black onyx ring or something. There was a lot of discussion on that. And the picture that Ron was referring to of him in the kimono, I have in my mind's eye which photograph that is when he was in China. What I said, Don, the other night was, that business of him wearing a ring in World War II, from what I have been told, I don't have memory of that. And I was a little bit like, why are they making such a big deal about having him wear a ring on his left hand? Because, hell, he and my mom didn't get married until 1952, so it obviously wasn't that. So, but Rona's referring to that. Yeah, the picture of him in China I can see that in my mind's eye. And come to think of it, he did have a ring on in that photograph. My dad never said anything to me because I tell you, throughout my life, he never wore jewelry. He wore a wristwatch, and that was about it. He never wore a wedding ring, nothing. He wasn't big on jewelry. He wore an EGA on his hat that he wore doing yard work, but he had no jewelry, no frills. So that's interesting.
And so if you want to email us, please do so at mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com. Garrett, you kind of gave out your quick plug to your Instagram earlier, but before we wrap up the show, do you want to get it out there again?
Yeah, just my first and last name, Garrett Shetrawski on Instagram. There'll be updates following that. Again, my timeline is have this manuscript done by the end of the year, and to go into a publishing process. I think there will be an appetite for it. I'm very excited to tell the story, and again, RFI out there for anybody who thinks I should miss anything or there's information that they would like to share with me. I'm all ears always.
Jeff, do you have anything coming down the pike you want to plug?
Well, are we gonna talk about what we're reading, or have I skipped ahead?
No, we can cover that. What you reading?
I just love hearing you say that. So I can't wait to tell y'all because I guess it's somewhat relevant to what we've been talking about. I picked up with the Old Breed again.
Nice. Just
the other night. I mentioned this, I think, last episode. I was in the middle of...
Yeah, you said you were thinking about it.
I was thinking about it, and, I hosted author Dennis Blocker the past few nights here at the house. We had an Iwo Jima 78th anniversary program at the museum yesterday, and book talking. We were talking about all the books, and he's over here staring at all that. And I said, yeah, I don't read books twice very often, but with the Old Breed, I think for me, it's like reading it for the first time again. Like I said, it's just under a whole different circumstance than I read it before. And I wanted to point something out because I think it sets the tone for the whole book. And maybe, Henry, you'll appreciate this, but on the very first page of chapter 1, Making of a Marine. The very first sentence of this book. I enlisted in the Marine Corps on 3 December 1942 at Marion, Alabama. That is about the least inspirational sentence to start a book with. It's the most matter of fact. That to me, when I read that sentence, I don't know how many times when I first picked the book up again. And I'm not saying that, of course, I'm not saying that in a bad way. What I'm saying is that prepares the reader that this is not it's not going to be some eloquent soliloquy of combat, and this is not
romanticized.
No, this is what I did when I did it, where it happened, and I think, from what I remember of this book, that first sentence is perfect to prepare the reader for exactly how Henry's father was going to write this book.
That's a really good point, Jeff. Nobody's ever said that before. That's thought-provoking.
Yeah, I was stuck on that one sentence. Also behind me, I know you guys have been eyeing the cover of this Life magazine up, and for those of us on just listening, you're just missing out. I'm not even going to describe the cover of this Life magazine, but what I will tell you, this was a newly acquired. This was a gift to me from yesterday. Actually, it was given to me from one of our newest volunteers at the museum, who had a Bundles for Britain exhibit also as part of a temporary thing for our Iwo Jima program yesterday. And so she bought this for me, and the date is March 26th, 1945. Now, some of the historians listening know that that's the day that Nimitz said, oh, Iwo Jima is all of a sudden secure. That's just the date that they agreed on. So that's the date of this issue. And if you open it up, there is that famous flag raising, and it's the picture of, of course, the Marines raising the flag on top of Suribachi on 23 February 1945, which is 30 days before this issue came out. I'm not sure Life magazine had any idea how big that image was going to become for America, for the United States Marine Corps, for guys like Garrett to look back and refer to many, many times, and what this meant in Hollywood, for the country, for the history of the Marine Corps going forward to today, to 2023. This is a very relevant image. And to look back in history, of all the Life magazines I have, guys, this one to me really stood out in really a time capsule back in time.
That's awesome. Super, super cool.
Henry, what you reading?
Yes, sir. I'm got about 100 pages left in Hang Tough by Jared Frederick.
That's your first time through on that one, right?
It is my first time through, and really, really cool being able to call Jared a buddy and having had him. And that was not the first time he'd been on the show. It was the first time I'd met him. First time he'd been on since I've been co-hosting with you guys. But yeah, I'm enjoying that, man. I mean, as I was thinking about it earlier today, as interested as I am, as much as I loved Band of Brothers and the whole Dick Winters and all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Reading a book of his letters would not have been my first choice, okay? And that's not out of any lack of interest or respect for Dick Winters, but, because letters are just such a personal thing. They're meant for one person, but we've talked about it before, and I won't belabor the point. Just Jared using his narrative, and Jared and Eric Gore, I don't mean to exclude him, using their voice as that interstitial tissue, if you will, to kind of keep it all hanging together. It's very interesting to me for obvious reasons.
Well, and plus, as we've said before, because there's so many books about Dick Winters out there, most of it covers pretty much the same ground with a little bit of difference here and there. The subject matter in which they pulled from, i.e. the letters, it just, as we were saying like last week or the week before, it just gives you a more in-depth, well-rounded view of him as a person and as a leader, opposed to just as a historical figure.
Yeah.
I'm still, I'm almost done with The Longest Day. I kind of mentioned this a while back, but I don't want to, upset anybody, but this book is so damn good. And I'm a late viewer of the movie. I saw the movie for the first time like 3 years ago. You hear the saying all the time, though, the book is so much better than the movie. I don't even know how the two are related, other than the fact that they share names and they have the same subject matter. This book it's such a great book.
Long.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's not that long of a book, but it's so damn good, and the information that's in here.
Hold it up, Don. Let me look at that cover.
This is the 1966 cover, so it's
okay.
It's got like a watercolor, almost a borderline. It's green, blue, orange, and red. That's all the colors that are made up on it, and it's just the proverbial upside down M1 helmet on the shores. But it's such a damn good. And it's promoting the movie on the back. The Longest Day, now a Darrell F. Zunwick production, the greatest international all-star cast have ever assembled in a single motion picture. And then it literally has everybody and their grandmother who's in the movie. But, if you're like me and you saw the movie not too long ago, and you're like, it's good, but it's not great, read the damn book. It's a fantastic book. But, hey, Garrett, what you reading?
I am reading, sticking to World War II, but in Europe, it's called Goring's Man in Paris.
Okay.
And it's about the German officer who was a doctor before the war, a doctor of the arts. He was a young gentleman to earn his doctorate, but he was in charge of acquiring Goring's artworks while in Paris, from the Jewish collections that were stolen, from the museums that were raided, and then more importantly, bartering with people in Switzerland who were obviously looking to buy some of the greatest artwork in the world at a very reduced price.
Yeah. Fire sale.
Very interesting. He, the Nazi, the Dr. Loesch, who was about, actually didn't die until 2007. So
was he he wasn't the guy that was found with the apartment packed full of all the art, was he?
Yes.
That was him. I remember that story because I worked in radio back then. And I remember the photos are you guys familiar with that story?
His music apartment.
I'm going to say no.
So after all these years in 2007, they tracked him down, and he literally was living like in a 2-bedroom apartment, just packed wall to wall with all this stolen art. All this time. He must have got storage at some point and just put it in his apartment and was just held up in there with his art.
For sure. And Girl at Hildenbrand in 2012 too, and he was a direct dealer for Hitler. Just a very unique aspect of the war. We think about the blood and guts piece of it a lot, but what the Nazis had done from a culture standpoint or culture robbing standpoint, pretty remarkable.
Absolutely. And Henry, do you got anything coming down the line that you need to promote?
No, nothing that jumps out at me right now. I will say we got a letter right around the same time the whole Library of Congress thing started brewing up. I think at Auburn they wanted to display my dad's dress blues in the Student Union building where they have the Veteran Resource Center. Did I mention that? If I did, I'm sorry to repeat that.
No worries.
But yeah, for now, man, that's all I'm gonna.
And by the way, we did put up a video of you discussing, because that kind of came at the end of the show out of nowhere. And if you guys haven't seen that, or if you have, we kind of asked the question, what would you do? And so if you have any thoughts, suggestions on, if you're a Henry in that position, would you easily give up I don't want to say give up the Bible, but make it available where it's no longer in your possession, or would you hold on to it a little longer? So if you have any answers to that question, email us once again at mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com. And I think that's going to do it for this episode. We want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support, and for all those who went over to WTSPWorldWar2.com or D-410.com. You signed up for Patreon. Thank you so much. It goes a long way to support what we do here over at the show. And if you haven't done so, please head over to YouTube, look up Digital 410, or just search for the podcast name. Subscribe and watch our content, and you can join in on the conversation. We live stream every Monday, and we have a chat channel here, and you can come and ask questions, and we will bring it up on the air. But for myself, Jeff, Henry, and Garrett, we want to say thank you guys, and we will talk to everybody next week.
This has been a Digital 410 production.